Hi, Morgan. Come
How's
on
it
in.
going?
Good. Glad to have you.
Oh, thank you so much. You guys, I am interviewing today not a survivor from a communist country like our usual, but actually a man behind the scenes at this amazing location where we film. We're gonna look into all the artifacts that have been secretly placed behind us on this set when we interview everybody, and it's just amazing. I can't do it justice, and so we brought in Tim Barton. And I'm gonna let you introduce yourself because I'm not gonna do it justice. So if you wanna let everybody know how you're involved with this and the meeting of worlds that's behind the scenes here at American Journey Experience.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, my name is Tim Barton. I am the president of WallBuilders, and that's an organization my dad started back in the 80s to preserve and really present America's forgotten history and heroes, emphasizing the religious, moral, and constitutional heritage of the nation. And I think probably anybody who pays attention today sees that all those are under attack. And what has made our organization unique is we have what's considered to be the largest private collection of original artifacts, as you mentioned, many around us. The largest private collection from the founding era. And so over the years, my dad became very good friends with Glenn Beck. And Glenn Beck wanted to start a nonprofit, and my dad and I both helped run the nonprofit Mercury One. And through a collaboration with Glenn, with Mercury One, with WallBuilders, the idea for the American Journey Experience came up, where we understand that we have to recover part of the story of America, as right now there's so many lies about America, the goodness of America, and actually against notions of American independence and the free market economic system, right? Or conservative values or Christianity in favor of communism and socialism. And so we can go back and say, guys, historically, like these are failed attempts everywhere they're tried, but we can use history to do that. In the midst of it, Glenn said, we need to have a place where people can come and see history firsthand. And we very much are believers that people should be able to experience history, not just look at history. In the sense of, right, so there's artifacts that we say, hey, okay, wash your hands, we hold them a certain way, but you actually can hold history. And then it's an ownership level of history that it's not something some professor told you happened one time. You can say, no, I actually held original documents from American history. And so whether it's documents from Jamestown or Plymouth, where there's conflict of the narrative today, or things even from Christopher Columbus, we have some of those documents too. Almost today, every person that used to be celebrated as an American hero is being villainized today. And strategically, right, part of this Marxist idea is you want to undercut the foundation so that the house topples and you can rebuild the structure you want. It's very strategic things happening, but we have the actual documents, so we can go back and say, well, here's the story of what actually happened. And it's not nearly as heinous or grotesque as what was said. And oftentimes, the people that are being villainized were some of the more honorable heroes from the era. It's just people don't know that history. So the American Journey Experience is a place people can come, learn history, see history firsthand, and it is the largest private collection of these artifacts, which I'm sure we'll explore some of these later.
Yeah, I mean, it's an honor to get to film here, so I haven't gotten to thank you yet, but thank you for this.
Absolutely.
For everybody watching, we had to get personally approved by the guys at the top to do this, and in my head, I heard that people have filmed here before. I heard it was a normal thing to just ask if you could film and then do the usual process. But then it became apparent to me that this is a very special opportunity and not a lot of people get to film here. So the fact that we got personally approved, I think it's so special because these are the pieces of history, and then we're interviewing people from across the globe that are talking about not only their home country, but the connections between other parts of the world at the same time. I mean, earlier today we were interviewing someone who he escaped communist Romania, or not escaped, but the revolution happened, communism fell, the soft communists rose up, and he talks about the disappointment that was there after the revolution. But he talks about how he had a family member that was a merchant fisherman, and he would get to travel the world. And he came back with a pile of Mao's little red books one day, because at the time over in communist China, they were trying to ship those little books out as much as they could to spread the propaganda throughout the world. And so his uncle came home to communist Romania with a bag of these little red books. So it's all full circle. I know right behind the camera, there's a stack of little red books, originals, and it's fascinating to me. So thank you for that. Something that I want to talk about too, there's a million ways that our culture is being attacked. Family units are being attacked. Our history is being erased or rewritten. And especially in this digital age, it's a lot easier to burn books because you can just delete things and it's hard to track that things were even deleted. I was looking at History Channel's summary of the Boston Massacre recently, and they now call it a riot, where the angry, patriotic colonists decided to attack the lone British soldier defending the building. And so reading that, I'm like, that's not how I originally learned that story, but now it's a riot. Okay. There's a document back there that basically disproves the 1619 Project, right? And we're going to talk about that. But what's your thought on having these documents to prove what really happened back with America's founding, as you have Marxists and radical leftists in this country specifically trying to make America seem like a country not worth defending and keeping? So you guys have documents here that completely disprove all of it.
Yes, and the thing about having original documents is it allows you to have a place to go back to discover truth. The reality for most American culture is we don't know the story, so we don't know if we're being lied to or not when we hear the story. And so when we hear the story today, right, well, the Boston Massacre, this was a riot they had. And it kind of does seem like it was a riot. There was a textbook that came out several years ago, and they said that the Boston Tea Party was the first act of domestic terrorism, right? Because the British was the government, and these were terrorists against the government. And you see, history is so often, and history in general, but like the narrative is being shaped by people who have so often a political agenda, and they're trying to use the telling of the story to favor their political side instead of saying, let's just look and see what actually happened. Certainly, there are incredible lessons you can learn from history, but we live in an era where people aren't trying to be honest about the story they tell so often. In a very politically divided nation and really politically divided world, people care more about their side winning than what's actually true. And so what we love to be able to do is say, well, there's actual documents saying here's what's actually true, not just what fits a narrative. And as you mentioned with the 1619 Project, we actually have lots of documents that would disprove every foundational level of the 1619 Project, where the 1619 Project says that slavery first started in America in 1619. You go, actually, the first African slaves were imported into America in the 1530s because after Columbus discovers the New World, well, it wasn't instantly colonized, but when colonies were developed, you had Spanish colonies and French colonies, and then you had English or British colonies. And the first African slaves imported actually were imported on a Spanish slave trading ship in the 1530s. So, and this is mainland, continent, North America, United States. So this is the area that we would know as North America, but you can keep going further because in 1619, when the slaves first arrived in Jamestown, they had been on a slave trading vessel. Presumed to be a Portuguese slave trading vessel. There were two British privateer ships that attacked this Portuguese vessel, and they overwhelmed the vessel. So these two British ships decided whatever's on board is now going to be their booty, right? And so they get to keep the cargo. Well, among it, they had on this Portuguese vessel lots of slaves. One of the British ships took approximately 19, some say 20 slaves on board, and they said, all right, I mean, we're really out here just to kind of loot and ransack, and we're not trying to, be a slave trading vessel. Where can we unload these slaves? And the closest port for them to unload was the Jamestown colony. So they went to Jamestown colony to unload these slaves they just captured off this Portuguese vessel. And when they get to Jamestown, slavery was illegal in Jamestown in 1619. It was against the common law. So they said, well, we want to unload the slaves. They said, well, you can sell them as indentured servants. But this is huge because indentured servants have a specified period of years they work, and at the end of that years, they're given freedom. In the Virginia colony and the Jamestown colony, not only were they given freedom, they were given their own parcel of land, usually about 40 acres. So these individuals who were slaves came to Jamestown, they became indentured servants, which, I mean, granted, it could have been miserable conditions for those presumably 7 years that they worked.
Yeah.
It could have been awful, but at the end of those years, they were given freedom and they became free landowners in America. And the point is, the narrative isn't just entirely different than what is being promoted today. And it's not to say that there's not terrible things that came out of Jamestown, because we've got some awful things from Jamestown. If you go back and just study history, when Governor John Smith he was Captain John Smith, he became the governor. He recognized the people of Jamestown were incredibly lazy. Part of the reason from the British system was in Great Britain, nobody really owned their own land. Under the king would determine that a lord or noble could have a certain tract of land, right, in his kingdom. But at any point, the king could take it away from that lord or noble and give it to somebody else. And then you had your commoners, your peasants, your serfs, who would work for a lord or noble. and you would work on somebody else's land. At the end of the day, you were given your food, your paycheck, and people didn't really know how to work for themselves when they came to America. So in Jamestown, Governor Smith is now the governor. The people are having to work for themselves, and they don't know how to do it. And Governor Smith passed a law that says if a man doesn't work, he shouldn't eat. And it was based on a Bible verse, 2 Thessalonians 3:10. And the people of Jamestown became very frustrated. This guy's making us work. This is ridiculous. There was a gunpowder explosion that was reported to be an accident, but the only injured person was John Smith, who was the one forcing them to work. There's actually reports that John Smith actually made a whip. He would go to people's homes and he was like, "You're being lazy, get out in the field and work." And he understood if they weren't productive on some level, they wouldn't survive. The problem was, even with this notion of their productivity, is it was an early form of socialism where everybody, it was a community pot. So everybody shared together. So, with many laborers, they could produce. This was their thought. And so when this gunpowder explosion happened and John Smith has to go back to England to recover, there's a new governor there and he says, "Okay, guys, I understand some of you are more important than others. Some of you have money. I'm not going to make everybody work. We'll make maybe the poor people, kind of like in England, the serfs, the peasants, they can work." Well, that winter was known as the starving time in Jamestown, where they have hundreds of people. In that winter, almost all of them starved to death, where you get to the next spring and there's like 60 people left.
Yeah.
And in the midst of this, the darkness of Jamestown is crazy. When people talk about the 1619 Project, we generally hear of Jamestown being evil because of slavery. I would point out Jamestown, long before 1619, had some major evil issues. When the starving time hit and they decide they need food, they eat the cows and the oxen, the horses first. Again, they had not grown crops. They didn't have the sustenance and provision. They were lazy, generally speaking. And so they eat all of their animals and they run out of food. And they're like, what else are we going to do? So then they turn to the pets and they ate the dogs and the cats, and they ran out of food. And at this point, there's already people who were starving to death because they didn't have enough food. And it occurred to somebody, some of those people who starved to death, we just buried them yesterday. They still have meat on their bones. So the idea was, let's go to the cemetery and let's start digging up all of the people who have died and let's just eat the meat off their bones, which is what they did. They dug up the cemetery during the starving time.
I didn't know this. I call myself a history nerd. I had no idea this was going on.
Yeah, and all this is very well documented. So it gets even crazier because in the midst of this, they run out of even food in the cemetery, food, loosely speaking, food, right?
I gotcha.
So they run out of food in the cemetery. And so, for example, there was a man, a husband, who had a pregnant wife, and he killed his wife and ate his wife and unborn child. And there's details about the gruesomeness of this. And the reason I point this out is, if people wanted to tell the story of Jamestown's really terrible, I can show you actual documents of why Jamestown was really terrible. But the narrative that's told today is not an honest or true narrative by and large, but it's still trying to depict how bad they were. If you just tell the truth, you don't have to make up history. Just tell the truth and let it be what it is. There's lessons we can learn from it, but today, history is such a politically emboldened narrative, that we're telling it in such a way to help our side look good or not look good. That's not what history should be. And again, as you mentioned, that's why we have these original documents that actually tell the real story, firsthand accounts from people who were there, as opposed to some journalist, as opposed to some professor or whoever else the case might be. We say, let's just go back and look at the original documents and see what they say.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be said by that. I had no idea that cannibalism was happening in Jamestown, so I'll have to go read about that tonight. Specifically with just knowledge being powerful and history being weaponized, do you know James Lindsay? You met him. I really like him. And he contributed, I think, to a book called Counter Wokecraft. Is that what it's called? And what always stuck with me was that concept of, knowledge is just a weapon that is used by whoever's in power to oppress the people who are not in power or to control them. And when you think about it like that, I think that's what we're going through. I mean, I think we need to upend the entire education system. And one of the biggest problems that I see looking back, I graduated high school in 2015. I see one of our biggest problems is not only not including the 20th century information, not teaching how these dictators came to power by promising really nice, fluffy sounding things, but not teaching comparative history. So the idea that human history has been pretty gruesome.
Right.
Humans in general, mankind, not ideal for a huge portion of history. And so that's, first of all, what made America so special is Charles Kessler's edition of the Federalist. Have you read that one? Such a good introduction. And he talks about how they made a government that understood mankind's faults and protected against wrongdoing, but also allowed for the opportunity of human excellence at the same time. And so having that appreciation for the fact that, wow, things could be really bad, or they were really bad, but we've come so far from that, completely lost in terms of America's education system, passing that to our kids. So having the information here, not only is it interesting with the original documents that you have, but there's some really scary stuff in this room. I mean, like, I was holding some things and I was like, oh, that's what this is. And so being able to see the gruesome parts of history is also a reality check for people that maybe, I don't know, think there's concentration camps at the southern border, or think America committed genocide, or have these terrible imaginations of what we're actually about. My worry is that because we flamboyantly use language, like say concentration camps are at our border and that America is so evil and racist, then when you have a country like communist China committing genocide and having concentration camps, it's hard for American liberals, what I've noticed, and people on the left in my generation, to look at something like communist China and say, well, we're no better. How can we say that that's wrong when we have concentration camps at our border? That's the kind of conversation I have with my generation. So I know that the work that you do is in multiple areas. What are you doing about education and making sure that we're connecting the history of the country and the world to my generation and now multiple generations of young Americans in the classroom and beyond? I mean, should we even rely on the classroom, or should we be looking outside?
Well, and we talked off camera. We think there's a lot of problems in the education system.
It's a loaded question. I'm sorry for that.
But it's a fair question, because there's so many people out there right now going, what do we do? Right? I mean, for parents and grandparents whose kids are in the midst of this, what do we do? And I think one of the big things right now is a lot of people are learning, even at the university level, is universities and the degree program is not as significant for future success as it used to be, right? If you go back to the 1950s, 60s, I mean, 70s, even degrees, like that was significant. You had a degree, that opened up a lot of job market opportunities for you. Today, we're looking at that and realizing that when you have less than 20% of students who graduate having actually the opportunity to find a job in their specified area of the degree field, most people are not finding jobs in the way they were educated. Now, it could be because there's not a lot of jobs for, gender studies majors or whatever the case might be. Yes, a lot of what we are teaching is utterly a waste of time, and it's loaded with indoctrination. With that being said, one of the things that we are trying to do is help people know not only that there is more to the story, but help them know how to dig deeper. It's very common that people will hear a certain narrative, and if you hear something long enough, right? I mean, fundamentally, we understand if you hear a lie long enough, then you just think, well, that's the way it is. And it's a little bit reminding me of George Orwell, right? In 1949, he writes his famous novel, 1984, which now seems to be just totally prophetic, right? And what he was explaining, but one of the things that he explained in there in the midst of Newspeak and their education, how they change things, well, we've always been at war with this nation. We've never been at war with that nation, but one of the things he points out is that whoever controls the present controls the past. Whoever controls the past controls the future. So the people who are in charge of the education system today, they control the present, but when you control the present, you control the narrative of what is said about the past. And based on what you think about the past will dictate and determine the direction you're going in the future. When you had just a year or two ago, a U.S. senator in the actual Senate chamber said that America did not inherit slavery, we created the institution of slavery. And you're like, dude, have you never read a world history book? This is crazy, because America's only been around a couple hundred years. Like the Greeks and Romans, way before America, they were doing slavery, and he actually is a self-professing Catholic. Now, I'm a Christian, and as a Christian, we believe the Bible. Even in the Bible, Moses, right, led the Israelites out of Egypt, where they were slaves in Egypt. So everything about this, it's a very dishonest take, but this is where we're seeing education really go and where that promotion is. And so, as I was mentioning, one of the things we try to do is when people hear these narratives, we want to give them a place where they can come and investigate and say, is that true, and how do we know? And we're not resting it on the authority of an individual. I mentioned that my dad, David Barton, he's done a lot of work with Glenn Beck. I do a lot of stuff here. We have several different curators and historians that are around here doing things, and we would tell everybody, you shouldn't take our word for a single thing we say. Don't trust anything we say. We understand the reason our nation's in the trouble that it's in is because we've trusted people for way too long when some of them were not honest players and they were disingenuous. And some people, maybe were very well intentioned but had bad information. And so with bad information, they're repeating things that are not accurate and not true. And this is where you get these notions of even your Democrat socialists, where you ask them, hey, where has socialism ever worked? Where has it increased somebody's prosperity? It's increased their personal freedom? They're like, well, okay, it hasn't in those nations, but they didn't do it the right way. We're going to be Democrat socialists. And you're like, no.
Yep, and then the Nordic Europe thing, and then Venezuela's not the real socialism. It's the same
all
repeated
these narratives,
pattern,
right?
And it's very sad. I think for me, I look at all of this and I'm very disappointed in the complacency. And so I notice that perhaps if we could just get people to care a little bit more.
Yes.
And by that, I mean rethinking what we've gotten so complacent with. So community, leadership, education, educating our kids, raising a family and not depending on the world to raise them, but saying like, I want to change culture, so I'm going to start with my own family.
Yeah.
I mean, I have people that make fun of me. They're like, oh, you're not going to expose your child to the outer world. You're going to shelter them by homeschooling them on your homestead. Like, you're going to hide away. And I was like, no, I'm not going to lie to them or anything, but I am trying to have a positive influence on the world by not letting my kids be raised by bad culture and a bad world out there. Hopefully we can have a positive impact instead of just complaining.
Yeah,
And so it's this apathy.
Well, and I would even add to that, when people are critical of this notion that you're going to raise a family and you want to protect what your kids hear, and that, right, well, you're so nice, whatever kind of adjective they associate with it, ultimately what they are showing is that they believe that truth is malleable. They believe in the power of the state, right? That you should acquiesce, you should submit to whatever the government tells you to do, when historically and fundamentally, we know that by and large, the history of the world, when you study whatever kind of government it was, right, and there's lots of different governments, whether it's your totalitarian or your oligarchs or your kings. I mean, you can go down the list of different kind of governments, your dictators, your socialist nations, communist nations, and a lot of those blend together in a lot of ways. But as you start looking at this, you're not going to find a place where the government has grown to be a massive power and they've continued to do incredible good for their people. Right?
That's very simple.
And so what we're saying is, well, how dare you want to shelter your kids? Like, why wouldn't you? You're not paying attention to culture at all, or you don't believe right and wrong exists if you don't want to shelter your kids at this point.
Yeah.
Right? Absolutely. I've got some little children in my family right now. My wife and I have a couple little girls, and there's no doubt about it. We're going to shelter them because there's some things that are evil in the world, and I don't want them to have to combat evil before they're ready to combat evil.
Yeah.
Right?
They're going after the kids.
There's no doubt.
There's a lot of questions. I mean, I'm conservative, and me and my friends, all of us like young 20-something conservative women, we're talking right now about like, we need not only traditional husbands, but we need men that would actually stand between me and our kids and the government that now thinks they can use force versus choice on our family. So like that's a big question now in the dating world of like, is this guy going to be capable of some important things in the future? Now, something that happened, I want to ask you about State of the Union. It just happened. Everybody was asking, is President Biden going to gaslight us? Is this going to happen? Is this going to happen? I'm not even going to watch it because it's all just a bunch of lies. People were saying, I can't believe you watched it, Morgan. I couldn't stomach it. And my message was, no, I want to watch the original tape.
Sure.
I want to watch the original, actual full speech and then take my own thoughts and walk away with them instead of seeing the headlines and the clickbait about, oh, he had a gaffe or, oh, he gaslit about something else. I don't want somebody else's opinion on what happened. I want to be able to see the originals. I want to be able to understand and have my own thoughts on it. So that's also something really important about these documents. And not just the good ones, but the bad ones.
That's right.
We need to see them and understand them. And I don't think it's over here, but there's like a whip from a Nazi concentration camp right over there on the table. And it's hard to look at. It's a lot and overwhelming to look at. But can you talk about what that is? Because when the left talks about progress, when they talk about their promises, when you hear young Americans talking about things, it's all rainbow, fairy tale land, the usual. And it's really sad because it's a repeated pattern. Why is it important for them to see the history of the negative aspects of socialism, communism, and just government tyranny in general?
I think one of the positions of the modern left is the innate goodness of man, right? That people are basically good. And so they don't prepare for the fact that people could actually do really bad, horrific, evil things. Or if that happened, it would never be. It's like, that wouldn't be America. We would never let that happen in America. And this is one of the things that was alluded to moments ago. Founding fathers, when they created our Constitution, they understood in this notion of the depravity of man. In fact, John Adams, I wrote several letters about it. George Washington did, James Madison did, Alexander Hamilton. All of them said, explaining the reason we have to separate power in America is because the heart of man is wicked and deceitful, and it can't be trusted. Well, they were actually quoting a Bible verse, Jeremiah 17:9. But the reason I point this out is it's a faith concept that says that people aren't innately good enough themselves, and there was a reason that God sent his son Jesus, and he's a savior. And right, whether people believe in Jesus or not, it's important to recognize the reality of human history and mankind is that people are not basically good. And people left themselves don't always desire to do good things, and especially not doing good things to others. When they have the ability to abuse, when they have the ability to take something away, when they're the bigger, the stronger, the more powerful, the founding fathers called it the law of the tiger or the shark. When you're bigger and more powerful, you will abuse and take away unless there's a check and balance put in place on some level. It's why we created the American system the way we did. The founding fathers had that understanding. But I think modern leftists look and they have this idea that man is basically good, and therefore, if something goes wrong, it had to be the outside circumstances instead of recognizing, no, like some people just do evil things because there's evil inside of them. Mm-hmm. This is where looking at history, you can realize that evil is an actual possibility. And as you're mentioning, even some of your conservative girlfriends where you would want, I don't know a single woman who would not want a strong man to be able to stand up and defend her. Now, not that there's not strong women, right? I'm not suggesting that, but the reality is I don't know a single woman who wants to marry a weak man who has no backbone and won't stand up for anything. This is the reality when you recognize there's evil, is there are times when you have to stand up to the evil, and there's times when not standing up to evil is itself evil, right? Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. Going back to Dietrich Bonhoeffer and some of those leaders from World War II who were standing up against that. Martin Niemöller, right? Some of these guys who were saying, we have to stand up because if we don't, then we are tolerant, complicit in this evil. And when you look at history, it's very clear that you can have well-intentioned people who, when their motives, when their actions are not checked by an objective moral standard, then they can get into some very dark things, and we want to learn those lessons. It's a very slippery slope. It's one of the reasons that even for many conservatives, we were hesitant of a Donald Trump presidency, right? When he said, we'll make America great again. That was kind of close to some of what Hitler was saying. We're going to make Germany great again. And you're like, well, I'm not sure what kind of leader he's going to be, and there wasn't really past precedent you could evaluate what maybe kind of leadership principles were going to be. And come to find out, he was one of the most constitutional presidents we've had in American history since maybe Calvin Coolidge. Again, just kind of grading on that level. Not talking about his vocabulary or his tweeting, but his policies. Constitutionally speaking, we have not had a more constitutionally limited, bound, and constitutionally accurate president in the way that he behaved policy-wise since Calvin Coolidge. But this is where from history you can learn when people start going a certain direction, there are some very slippery slopes. Yeah. When we think, hey, it's for the good of the people that we're going to give up our freedom and the government's going to come in. That's just historically never worked out well for the people who gave up freedom for their own good. Yeah, it's a tale as old as time. And what I worry about, just because I can speak to it of like the most recent style of educating young people in the 20th century, I see a lot with my generation. We hear those same promises, like you said, sometimes there's repeated patterns throughout history, and when somebody is giving you some red flag signals like, oh, that phrase has been said before and good things didn't come from it, we hear that with progress, the promise of social justice, the declaration that I'm not a communist, I'm a democratic socialist. Fidel Castro called himself a democratic humanitarian. So give me a break, right? Sure. That kind of stuff happens all the time. Hitler wasn't a communist either. Yeah. He was very against it. I love hearing the secret writings of the people in his close circle, though, that talk about how, he didn't want to be associated with the communists and Marx because he didn't like the Bolsheviks, and there was all this inner battling. And now you have the leftists today. You will have communists today tell you it was the communists that beat Hitler. And that was because of Russia's involvement in the World War. A whole thing, but the history is so distorted on it. Now they're the ones that claim that they are going to punch a Nazi in the face because just like in the 20th century, that's what the good communists did with Hitler. So they think they're repeating that big rise up against the Nazis, but here in America. Totally a mess. But in the classroom, we were not taught that when somebody promises fill in the blank for all policies, or when someone says, I'm not a communist or a socialist, I'm a democratic socialist, or when someone follows that repeated pattern of how a leftist rises to power, even if they're democratically elected, like in Venezuela, bad things will happen and they're probably lying to you and that policy will fail. Right.
we don't see that kind of behavior and then have red flags go off in our head because we aren't even taught from the beginning that that behavior is a red flag. We aren't taught it anymore.
Correct.
So then we hear it from American leftists today. No red flags go off in our heads. We just say, this sounds great. What could go wrong? And what do you know? It's a shame. So I don't want to keep it too negative, and I want to get to the artifacts. So I know I asked you about having the negative artifacts around. I mean, the Nazi concentration camp whip that's back there. But there's some exciting stuff even on this table. So let's end this session with talking about, are you trying to excite people about history? You know what I mean? Like, are you trying to paint a vivid picture for people so that it's not just some boring picture in a textbook or what their professor's saying? So let's talk about that, maybe end on a positive note and then get to the artifacts.
Absolutely, yeah. So the reality is when you study the story of American history, it is one of the most exciting stories. Now, there are some dark moments along the way.
Yes.
Just like any story, there can be good, bad, and ugly. Growing up, I was a Lord of the Rings fan, right? There's light, there's darkness, there's some good moments, some bad moments. As a Christian, you see it in the Bible. So there's no doubt in history, you're gonna see some of all of it. But history should be one of the funnest, most fascinating stories. The problem is today, most people don't learn the story of history. They learn names, dates, and dead people. That's not exciting at all, right? Like, why do I care who died on what day? And like, there's no story to it. There is a reason that Hollywood makes cajillions of dollars a year by telling stories. Stories are fascinating. Stories are fun. And this is what is by and large lost. So what we want to do is be able to recapture some of the actual story, and we use original documents to help tell the story so that we actually have pieces of history. So we say, okay, you've heard of this person? Here's the story, but here's this part of that story. So it gives you a different level of connection to the story, which helps the story come alive on an even greater level. And absolutely, we want to excite people with history. We want them to come to the American Journey experience and take a tour through this and be blown away. We have, you mentioned a few interesting pieces, and sometimes interesting from a negative perspective, but there are some amazing things from the positive perspective too. Yeah. And you're like, wait a second, that was whose? And this is what?
That was me all yesterday.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's our idea, is we want people to come through and we want history to come alive for them because we understand the value of history, that you learn those lessons. So often history is repeated time and time and time again because the people repeating history didn't learn the lesson from the last person that repeated it. So there's two ways you can learn, either from someone else's mistakes or from your own. History is a very good friend to those who are willing to learn because then you can learn from other people's mistakes and not have to make all those mistakes yourself. And that's really our heart and prayer for America, is we can learn some of these lessons from other nations and actually even from our own self. Going back historically, there's a lot of times we tried things already that did not work, but we have to remember our history to remember we don't want to do that again.
Okay, that's awesome. And speaking of stories, part of what initially inspired me to do this, and especially over the last year, to get into a more serious producing mode for these videos and to document the stories. How many times have you heard people these days, through the era of COVID, through the era of the mandates and actual force instead of choice passed down by our lovely federal government and the bureaucracy, fourth branch that exists now, people say, this reminds me of 1984, or this reminds me of V for Vendetta. And I just wish, in my heart of hearts, that people would look at something like the totalitarianism and the elimination of people from the public square and from their positions of power and say, this reminds me of the Cultural Revolution of China. This reminds me of something in Mao's Little Red Book. Or they look at the thought censorship and they say, this reminds me of Romania, where they shot people for daring to speak out. For Venezuela, I wish people looked at the shutting down of businesses in America via regulation and bureaucracy and said, this reminds me of how they seized the means of production in Venezuela. When they steal land, this reminds me of Cuba. I wish that we looked, because the stories are very prevalent and there, and they just aren't told anymore. So now we say, this reminds me of this like fake movie that I saw one time on Netflix. It's very real. It all happened before, and it's going to happen again unless we learn. So with that being said, I think we should look at all the artifacts.
Let's do it.
Let's get started. Yesterday when I first saw these things, I literally texted my mom and I said, this was the best day of my life. Not exaggerating, this has been awesome, and I just wanted you to give an awesome run through of just how important some of these things are just behind us on the table, and I got to touch some of them. It was amazing. Let's get started.
These are all pistols from the American Revolution. On these pistols, there would be kind of a maker's mark of who had done these, and on some of these, here's a great example. This was a British pistol. So this is the King's Royal Crown. At the bottom is GR for Georgius Rex. So this was an actual British pistol from the American Revolution. During the American Revolution, and if you want to hold it, you're totally welcome to. During the Revolution, at that point, pretty much only officers would have pistols. They'd be mounted on horseback. It was common for them to have 2 pistols. They would have a sword or saber as well. And so that was something from officers. On all of these old guns, if you look at the back, there's a butt plate. And the reason was it would take you 30, 40 seconds, if you were good, maybe 20 seconds to reload this as you're having to, you're pouring your powder and your ball and your wadding and the ramrod and flash pan opens and you're doing all the operation. It takes a while. So they would turn it around and that metal butt plate became a club as you're on horseback, right? And you can, so all of these old guns, whether it was a musket or one of these pistols, they all have a metal butt plate. And that was designed to
Another weapon.
Be uncomfortable. Yeah,
Okay.
That was the idea.
That seems like it would work.
I probably got the job done. Absolutely. Now, speaking of getting the job done, staying kind of in the weapon tradition, this is a actual battle tomahawk from the American Revolution. So for people who've seen The Patriot, right, the more iconic scene definitely involves the tomahawk. It's not a far-fetched thing that those frontiersmen and woodsmen had these battle hatchets or battle tomahawks. So this one is totally original from the American Revolution.
Wow.
So we can track it back and know some general information about it, but as far as the specific date, we don't know exactly when it was made, but we do know it was used in the American Revolution and then presumably had to be made before that to be used then. You know, even along the line, we do have full muskets, and so we have several bayonets for the muskets. We actually have like 13 or 14 different muskets in the collection, all from the Revolution. And so bayonets, we have several different kinds of bayonets, but it's something that when people come, this is something that we do then on occasion allow people to hold the musket to feel the weight of it.
Heavy.
All right, to try to imagine the process of your loading, and the muskets are only accurate at 30 or 40 yards, generally speaking.
Yeah.
And so you have to be really close to the enemy. Like the whole thought is just, for this, sharp on the sides, I'll trade you.
Okay.
So that's called a caltrip. A caltrip.
Oh.
Are you familiar with this?
I have a feeling I know.
So it's what they would use to stop a charge, whether it be from the infantry or cavalry. And so if you're in a position where you don't have the ability to kind of guard on all sides, they would take hundreds or even thousands of these and they would throw them out on one side to kind of protect their flank or their rear.
Yeah.
And so if somebody's running, whether it be a person or a horse, if they step on it, then that's going to go into their foot and that's not going to be a good day for them. And it's designed so that no matter how it falls or lands, there's always a spike sticking up. This, I don't know, think movies again. Probably weren't alive. Oh, you know Jurassic, okay.
It looks like it.
This is from the movie Jurassic Park.
Okay.
So, right, when they find that mosquito embedded, like this is what it is. As we go, we mentioned earlier that there are some documents that refute some of the narrative and notion of like the 1619 Project. So this was a document that identified us from St. Augustine, so Florida, and generally that was Spanish colonies. They said we're going to trade in gold, we'll trade in slaves, and they identified several things they would trade in. But this is an official government document from 1610 greenlighting the slave trade in Florida, the African slave trade in Florida.
So this basically disproves the American radical Marxist movement's 1619 Project. They are trying to rewrite American history.
Yes.
Make it so that America is not a country worthy of being proud of or defending, especially for young kids. They're trying to teach this to young kids. And this document completely dismantles the argument.
And this isn't even the only one or the strongest one that we have, but it's one that certainly does everything we're mentioning, because if America started in 1619 with the arrival of the first slaves from Africa, that's what we're told. It's the first slaves that got here from Africa. It was 1619 Jamestown. Nope. There were many slaves coming from Africa long before they arrived in Jamestown, because the slave trade in Africa started in 1500, right? And at that point, you had slaves coming to North, Central, and South America long before they ever arrived in Jamestown. However, America also was the first nation in the world to sign a law banning the slave trade. Thomas Jefferson signed it March 2nd, 1807. So we have a lot of those documents we mentioned. We have 160,000 documents, items, artifacts from American history. And it's just going back to show what actually we did, and what we did is very different than the narrative we hear today. This is just a painting of Abraham Lincoln. It's really fun going back to earlier days, and just a depiction. We actually have a lot of cool stuff from Lincoln. We have several documents from him, actually a really cool one from a pastor that Lincoln had gone and preached in this pastor's church. And he gave a description of what Lincoln had done from the pulpit, just the things that we don't really hear about Lincoln or wouldn't think about him. And so we have these documents and evidence to kind of walk through it. This is a flag from the D-Day invasion from World War II. So, I mean, right, pretty as much American as you can get. On the D-Day invasion, there were multiple beachheads, kind of beach fronts where we had troops going off. This was on a kind of a command vessel, and it ended up going to all 5 beachheads where we had troops getting off.
That's amazing. And this is what's really the focal point of our set. This is behind it. I don't know if you've seen the shot.
Yeah.
But it is right smack dab in the middle, and that's one of the first things the team told me about when we got approved for this. We've got the D-Day flag. It's so
awesome.
Exciting.
The next thing we can just kind of walk along and see, this is a Civil War drum. And so a Union drum from the Civil War, and this kind of would have been more of a parade drum. We have a lot of stuff from the Civil War. So yeah, as we keep going, so these are things actually back from more of the early Pilgrim kind of era. Cotton Mather and then John Cotton were individuals actually involved on some level with the witch trials in Salem, Massachusetts. And this connection is actually a little bit interesting because part of the connection from these guys is they're part of the ones who pointed out, like, this is not a good judicial practice. This actually needs to come to a stop. This is an oath of office from early America. This is before President George Washington. And what's significant is that when President George Washington put in the oath of office, it's actually not in the presidential oath today, but a lot of people say it as their oath, so help me God at the end. Almost every single state had a state oath of office that you had to say this to be an elected state official. New York actually did. And in New York, the end of their oath was, so help me God. This is from back in 1620. This is one of the first written documents that actually identified the shipload of slaves that arrived in Jamestown. So this is from the Jamestown colony. So that's 1620. And in this history, they talk about there was this ship that came and unloaded slaves in Jamestown. So the 1619 narrative, like the story they try to tell, part of it, this is the first documented telling of any of the story. We actually have been able to acquire over this last year the largest private collection of original documents from Jamestown and Plymouth. And so kind of we're mentioning some of the 1619 project, we now over the last year have acquired stuff that allows us to tell a story that nobody else is telling on a level that nobody else can tell because they don't actually have the documents.
Yeah.
We actually have the documents we can walk through and tell stuff.
That's great.
So along documents, one of the things we do hear often about is like the witch trials. So this is from the actual judge who oversaw the witch trials in America.
Okay.
Governor Phipps goes to Judge Sewell and says, hey, have you been doing it this way? And he's like, well, yeah. And the governor's like, yeah, that's not right. We need to stop that. So they called them into the witch trials. In America, 27 people ended up dying from the witch trials. In Europe, over 500,000 people died in witch trials.
What?
They went on
in the same, what time
They
period?
went on for decades. In America, it lasted a year and a half.
500,000?
In Europe, it went on for decades.
Do you know what time period? Like, did we nip it in the bud early on, or
Correct.
were we at the tail end?
No.
We transferred over to us.
We were more in the middle of it going on.
Wow.
So it
thank
continued
goodness
on.
we stopped
It continued on long after us. Correct. And it's where one of the things that we would point out is when people talk about America being so bad, well, is there more to the story, right? Is there context? And one of the things I will say is when people say, but America did so many bad things, the thing I think is a very important question is why did those bad things stop in America?
Yeah.
Right? Like who put an end to them? And what's interesting is without exception, the people who led the charge against the atrocities in American history were by and large Christians, pretty much without exception. It was always Christian leaders who identified biblical truth saying we shouldn't be doing these wrong things based on the principles that learned in the Word of God, and so they changed things. So this is another fun piece of history. This is the piece of a chest. It's a rounded chest, so it would be like kind of this top edge, but it was from the chest of Elder Brewster. Elder Brewster was one of the elders for the Pilgrims. It's actually believed by many that the Mayflower Compact wasn't signed on the table, it was signed on top of a chest, and it was signed on top of Brewster's chest.
Okay.
Yeah, so I know some of the cool artifacts that you thought were really fun are on the table. So if we want to mosey
Let's go see those.
Yeah.
Oh boy. So if you could give us the story behind these items, it's fascinating.
Yeah, so over on the side, we have some very decorative gloves. So these are actually from the scout, considered maybe the chief scout for Custer from Custer's Last Stand.
Were these normal gloves, do you know, back then?
So
Kinda fancy.
they were not normal gloves. They were very fancy, but it actually does fit with General Custer.
Okay.
He was known to be a pretty flamboyant, outward individual. It was reported that as he would go to different towns, had a long, blonde, flowing hair, a little bit of a ladies' man on some level. And so even like today, it's super silly for us to think about, but back then, he would take a lock of his hair, and he'd cut off a lock of his hair, and he'd give it to a lady and be like, "This is for you."
Oh,
right? Like,
I would totally fall for it. I'm already like, yep, it would work. But yeah, let's move on.
So speaking of hair,
Okay.
let me jump to this. This is a ring.
Uh-huh.
Okay, now you've probably already been walked through this a little bit. So this is one of my favorite pieces for several reasons. But there's hair inside of this ring. The hair is braided very nicely. I mean, genuinely impressively how it's kind of weaved together. So do you remember who the story is?
Yes.
Okay, so who is it?
I believe it's George Washington's hair.
And who was it given to?
Alexander Hamilton.
Is exactly right. Now, already there, right? That's two of the more noted people from American history.
Yeah.
Really impressive. So on Washington's deathbed, they actually cut several locks off, and apparently Alexander Hamilton got several locks. Now, Hamilton has a couple kids, his wife. Well, his wife ends up getting a lot of these, and somebody along the way decides that we need to put one of these locks of hair in a ring, which I don't know if you've tried it on yet.
May I?
But you should. You should try it on.
Can I put it on my wedding finger?
So you can tell your future husband, like, this is the kind of ring I need. It's pretty patriotic. So, you know, today people hear about Hamilton because of the musical, but this is a really incredible connection. That's not something you give as a gift to people necessarily. It's kind of a little weird in our culture.
I'm glad they did it though.
It's super cool.
I'm glad they did it.
And they recognize that, you know, hair doesn't deteriorate kind of the same that other gifts might.
Okay.
And so hair,
Yeah.
I mean, for some people, you know, mom's first haircut, they keep a lock of the kid's hair. That hair's gonna last.
Yeah.
So Washington's hair lasts. Speaking of Washington, Washington was a surveyor. And as a surveyor, you would have this tool, compass, and he would use it as he was doing work. Well, down here at the bottom, you can see there's a groove where his finger over time has just worn that down. Washington reportedly, this was the only compass he ever had his entire life. And so that is actually from George Washington.
And this is his fingerprint in the compass.
Yeah, the groove from his finger just wore that down over time.
And now my finger is there.
Where George Washington's finger was. So father of the nation, right? Leader of our nation on so many levels, incredible leader. And his compass. This is a Bible. It was a family Bible from the Lincoln family. So in the front of this Bible, it actually has a signature from Mary Todd Lincoln. Specifically, after Abraham Lincoln died, this was a Bible that Mary Todd kept with her. And we mentioned we have several things from the Lincoln family, but this is something too that a lot of people don't think of Abraham Lincoln, and really many founding fathers, many great leaders from our nation as being religious people, specifically not being Christians. And there's a really interesting faith journey with Abraham Lincoln where as he was growing up, and you might want to hold it, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a pretty cool piece of history.
I do, I'm sorry.
As he was growing up, he grew up in a home that the home was a professing Christian home, but his father was an alcoholic. And so his father would beat him. And so Lincoln had this impression of Christianity that was very mean and abusive. So as soon as he left the home, he became an atheist. And he was noted as the town atheist.
Really?
Yes, and actually really just pursues hedonism as hard as he can for a while. And as he then gets involved in politics, some of his motivation starts changing. And you actually can see in his life, there were different people that encountered him along the way, different lawyers, different ministers, and God gets a hold of his life. He actually told somebody after Gettysburg, he said, when I first became president, he said, when I left Illinois, I was not a Christian. And he said, when I went to Gettysburg and I saw the bodies of all these Americans who had died, he said, I told God that if he would help us in this, I would dedicate myself to him. He said, I am now a Christian and I do believe in Jesus Christ. And like this whole testimony from him, super interesting stuff. There definitely is a change in his idea where if you even read his second inaugural address, the second half of it is basically just him quoting the Bible and explaining basic Bible thoughts. This is when you see God's really starting to get a hold of his life. Lincoln quoted the Bible more than any president in American history, that you can just go to his speeches and find all the Bible verses. So really interesting connection with the Lincolns and the Bible, but that's part of what this is.
Yeah, I found the Book of Esther.
Oh, hey, there you go.
I had to do it. I had to find like some,
Significant.
Sorry.
So other noted Americans, Buffalo Bill. These are gloves from Buffalo Bill, which actually makes sense that he would have, right, animal hide gloves. This is a napkin, and there's blood stains on the napkin. It's still a little yet to be determined whose blood it is, although there's pretty strong suspicion. Allegedly, it was Hitler's blood. There was a attempt, there was actually several assassination attempts, most of them were failed. But it's even interesting, if you look at something as bad as who Hitler was, you can go back historically and recognize that not every German was supportive of what he did, right? There was a movement even then. So even when there are dark times in history, it's interesting that there oftentimes is a counter narrative as well, where there's people trying to remove the bad leader or do something to protect and preserve the rights of their countrymen and nation. So this is part of that story, and we could go on and on and on with thousands of artifacts and documents. But if people want to find out more, the best place is to go to either mercury1.org or the American Journey Experience. Look at it online. They can sign up for a tour, find out more information, and we would love to have them come check these out.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. I encourage everybody to come here whenever you can. I mean, you seem to have so many opportunities on the website. We'll link the website in the bio, you guys. But let's close it with this, a more fun Americana history. Can you tell us about what's on this? And then we'll close it.
So also, kind of a napkin, a little blood on here. Do you remember any part of the story whose this might be?
Oh, yes, I do. It is blood of Bonnie and Clyde, people. Bonnie and Clyde.
Right, so Bonnie and Clyde, legendary. This was actually on one of their persons when they ceased to be in this realm. So
what a nice way to put it.
You know,
if you do bad, you're gonna get taken out.
Yeah,
apparently.
Went out in a blaze of glory, so to speak. But we have such bizarre pieces of history, but this is kind of a cool one, Bonnie and Clyde.
Oh yeah, I'm a Western girl and I love Americana history. It's just so exciting. So that's a good one to close out on. You guys, thank you so much for watching, and please support and go visit American Journey Experience in Dallas. So exciting. Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Hey guys, it's Morgan. Before we head out, I just want to say thank you for watching the Freedom Records, and thank you so much to American Journey Experience for letting us film here in Dallas, Texas at their vault. You guys, this place is filled with world and American history artifacts. It's fascinating to learn the details of the objects that are right behind us on set. So thank you to American Journey Experience for letting us film here, and actually, you guys can come here yourself, so go to the link in our bio to learn how you can do that and how you can get connected to this great place.